Hi everyone, welcome back. It's been a while since I posted any new videos, apologies for that, it's been a bit busy. But today we're going to talk about something slightly different. Now, you've seen me do a number of videos on ServiceNow products, that's the company I work for. But what I want to do today is to talk about some stuff I have set up at home. And what we're going to talk about today is VLANs. Now I'm going to flash up on the screen, probably somewhere around here, a quick diagram showing you the layout of what we're going to be talking about. Now I'm going to be doing this over a number of episodes because there's quite a lot to cover, but today we're going to talk about the initial setup of a VLAN. Now I'm using TP-Link Omada equipment in my house and I've found it great. I've used it for a number of years. I only scratched the surface of what it can do because I'm not a networking expert, but I found it very useful for setting up stuff and just monitoring my house in general. So what we've got in the diagram that you can see on screen now, we've got a main switch, the TP-Link Omada switch in the middle. I've got a router that I've hooked up to fibre broadband that I have coming into the house. And from that, I've got a number of access points showing up in the diagram that you can see. And from that, I'm going to be creating a number of different wireless networks. One for my kids to use and one for my wife and other devices to use as well. Now I've got a number of these set up, but we're going to kind of group those together. What we're going to look at today is how I can use a wireless network defined for my kids using a VLAN and add all the extra security and monitoring and also the ability to switch off the internet quite easily for them from that. And a couple of things that came along that I had to fix along the way, which we'll talk about, which is multicast DNS, as well as access to printers and things like that. So without any further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we go about creating a VLAN. Now, I'm assuming that you're watching this video, you've probably already got this equipment set up. If you haven't, I can put some links to the various different pieces of equipment. No affiliate link or anything here, just literally the kind of stuff that I've got set up at home. Now, I'm not using one of their network controllers. I'm actually using the software version, which I'm hosting on a Proxmox server, which you can see up there, just as a virtual machine. Now, I did have a hardware controller, but I had to use that for something else in the end, so I just switched over to using the software one. It's easier to use the hardware one as a starting point because you don't have to worry about the hosting a system, all of that kind of stuff. And if it powers off, you can just power it back on again. So I would highly recommend, if you're new to this, using the hardware one. Great piece of little bit of kit, not super expensive, but just runs the whole system for you. Right, okay, so let's get started. So what we're going to be covering off today is how you go about creating a VLAN and setting up the rules to make sure that traffic stays on that VLAN. So what we're going to do is we go down to settings at the bottom here, we go to our wired networks and LAN. Now you'll see I've got a number of VLANs already created, so different LANs created. I've got a guest network one, which is, I've got a QR code that I can give to people, so when they come around to the house they can scan that, they get access to the internet, but they can't see anything else in the house. So I've got that pegged as VLAN 50. I've got IoT devices, so any of those Chinese devices that have to go and broadcast out to the internet, they have their own VLAN, which I can use for just controlling them, and it's easy then to switch that off if I need to. But primarily the thing we're going to be talking about today is my kids' VLAN. Now I went down, I spent a bit of time looking at how I could monitor, well, not watch what they're doing, but just be sure that they're, I put steps in place to make sure they're not going to sites they shouldn't do, etc. And because my kids' school use Chromebooks, I couldn't install anything actually on the devices. So I needed a way of effectively intercepting the traffic that goes to and from their devices in a controlled way. Now, during COVID, this is when I set this all up, it was important because they were at home all the time. So I'm just going to be running through what I did. So first of all, what you have to do, now I'm just going to click edit on mine so you can see what it is. If you go in and you create a new LAN, but what you want to do is create a new interface, not a VLAN. Now, I'm not entirely sure why, to be brutally honest. If anybody does, please comment in the comments below. But I found if I did that, I just couldn't get it to work. Now, that could be something I did wrong, but I found if I created an interface, I hooked it up to one of the LAN ports on the router, and I said, right, this is going to be VLAN 10. The reason I picked 10 was just so that I had gaps between the VLANs, so I didn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it just gave me room to change how the network would be over time. And what I did is I then created a DHCP range that incorporated that VLAN ID. So here I've got 192.168.10.1 as that DHCP range. Now I have set that range to be from 100 to 200. There should hopefully only ever be 4 or 5 devices on this particular network. So a range from 100 to 200 is plenty. I also started at 100, so I had plenty of room at the lower end of the network to put any devices that needed to have static addresses. Now, there are ways to do that in the Omada software to designate those, but I'd like to keep them separate and be able to manage that myself. Now, when you initially set that up, what I suggest you do is set the DNS server to auto, and that will just use the router's DNS information for your kids. Now we'll talk around in a later episode how you create your own DNS server for in my case for my kids, how you can use that and then be able to filter down and make sure they're searching safely on the internet. So we'll come back to that later. Lease time, you can leave that as a default. I set it to 120 minutes just so that we've got a rotation of leases and such like. Right. And that's really it. You don't need any of the advanced settings, or I've decided not to use DHCP v6 or IPv6 in this network. That may come later, but for now we're just leaving it here. So then you hit save. Now that's great. You've created a VLAN at this point, but it's not going to do anything because by default, when anything comes onto your network, it's going to use the default network, which is VLAN 1, and go from there. The next thing we want to do is create a wireless network for the kids. So what I've done here, you can see I've got a number of different ones. Let's go into my kids one. We'll talk about the portal a bit later. That's going to come in a later episode, but that's how you can then control how they have access to the internet. So what I've done, I've created a kids network. I just put my initials on it so I could find it easily. I could choose whether I'm going to use 2.4 or 5 gigahertz. I don't have any 6 gigahertz equipment, and their Chromebooks don't use it anyway. Now, probably better to put them up in the 5 gigahertz range, keep the noise down for all the IoT devices that use that lower range. Let them do that. But I've used both because sometimes they go slightly further from an access point and they need better connection. We set up a WPA personal, given it security key. What I've done under the advanced settings, I've attached it to that particular network. I could have done it by VLAN ID, but I think that's where the VLAN piece comes in, but I've done it by network. Set up the security mode, made sure they've got roaming set up, so 802.11r, so it allows faster roaming because we've got a number of access points in the house, so I want the laptops to pick up the best signal really for them. And that was pretty much it. So I didn't put a schedule on. I could have done, so I could have it so that wireless network just disappears in the evenings. So, if they're trying to be sneaky and be online when they shouldn't be, it would just magically disappear. If you've got kids that are doing you've got, say, a limited network capacity, you can use rate control to say, well, they've only got 2 megabits or 10 megabits or however many megabits you want to give them for them to use, which therefore means if you're like me working from home, they're not impeding on your ability to do your work. So very useful capability. So that's it. We've applied that and that's great. Now we can make sure that the kids get onto that as their default network. I had to do some other bits on my other networks, which I'll show you, is once I defined the kids' devices, and I've done that via IP, I've fixed them down to IP addresses, or I've done it could do by MAC address. What I did was, because they had been using the main network previously, what I've done was basically created a MAC list. So once the devices were online, I then captured their MAC addresses and put them into a group. We'll talk about that in a sec. And I said, don't allow the kids' devices onto any other network. So if they magically manage to find the password for one of the other networks and will try and circumvent what I put in, by doing this, they can try and connect to it. They may put in the right password, but their devices will just get kicked off straight away. So it was just a way of stopping them accidentally going via one of the other networks and avoiding the lockdowns that I put in place to protect them. So while we're talking about that, we might as well go on and look at that. So if you go into profiles, under profiles you have groups. Now you'll see I've got a number of different groups here. So my kids' devices. So, you know, the kids, their Chromebooks, their phones, the iMacs that they use. I've captured all of their MAC addresses. Now, what you will want to do also is make sure when they're, especially with the Apple devices, whenever they connect to the network, they're not using, you know, random MAC addresses, or they're not generating new MAC addresses. Because otherwise this kind of then doesn't work. But there are ways we can lock it down still, so even if they did that, they wouldn't be able to get on to do anything else. So I've also created groups for other things like the Apple TVs and the printers that we have, because what I'm going to be doing in a later episode is talking about how you can allow, well, we'll go through it quickly in this episode, but a later episode I'll talk about why we allow certain traffic to transcend the virtual LANs. Because you'll see from that diagram I showed earlier, I'll put it up again, I've got a printer set on the default VLAN, so I need my kids to be able to print stuff if they need to, so we need to be able to talk to that. And I also wanted them to be able to, with their phones, if they wanted to broadcast something up onto a TV to show my wife or myself, then they could do that as well. Okay, so we'll come back to the groups in a sec. So we've created the VLAN, the network. We've created the wireless, the access, SSID. There we go. I get my words out. We've created that for them, and we've now got them on there. So the next thing we need to do, and hopefully you're following along with this, is to set up the network security. So even though the kids' devices are going to go onto that particular wireless network, they will still be able to see the default VLAN or on its own. So they'll still be able to see that network. So what we're going to do is we need to create some ACLs, so access control lists. So I've got two different ones. I haven't created any at the gateway, but I've got some for my switch, or the switches, because we have more than one, but the switch and the EAP, so that's the access points. So if we start with the access points one first, what I'm saying here, so if I just edit this particular one, is access enabled for network and shared devices. We'll come back to this when we talk about the multicast DNS and how we're then transcending those VLANs for the different devices. So I'm just permitting, I've created a group, so it was an IP group for all of the printer, the Apple TV, so on, that I want the kids to have access to. Now I did also have to put into there the main controller address as well. Now we'll come on to that in a bit, but we'll talk about that. But then what I had to do on here was then also, if I come out of this one, is you'll see this one, I called it Isolate Kids Network. Now, what that's saying is I'm denying the kids access, and you'll notice the order in which I did those ACLs. The ACLs, they get executed in sequence until one of them is true. So if you've got a permit ahead of a deny, if you're allowing something through and it falls into that permit and it says true, then that the rules then stop. So you need to think about how you layer in those rules. So in this case, I'm isolating my kids network. We've got the kids network, but then it can't see any of the other networks. So effectively saying, right, this traffic is only going down this particular tunnel. And that was key. So that was for the wireless. And then I did a very similar thing for the actual switches as well, because the access points will be saying, right, you stay in your lane, but then it gets to the switch and the switch goes, oh yeah, it's all just traffic. But then we need to put some rules in on the switch to say, you need to still stay in your lane. We'll talk around these a bit later, but for now, all I've done, so if you're just setting up a basic VLAN with none of the other stuff that I'm going to be talking around, you just need to set up these deny rules. So what it is, when you set them up, and we'll go through and I'll set one up for you now, I'm just walking through these, is very similar to the access point rules. I'm saying the kids network cannot go onto any of the other networks. It's staying in its lane. So I've set up VLAN ID and that kind of stuff. So let's run through actually just creating a new rule. So what you do, and I'll just call this my temp rule. Obviously you'll give it a better name, and it's whether it's a deny or permit. So the protocols, you could just say for TCP and UDP, for the majority of the network traffic that they're going to be using, that would have been fine, but it's just easier to say all. And what we're going to say, the source rule is, it's going to be a network, it's the kids network, and then the destination is then every other network. So what we're doing here is we're saying the kids network is denied access to any of the other networks. Now the binding type, we're not going to bind it to a port because we've got a number of access points, so I can't just say it's for this port only. So in this case we're going to pick a VLAN. So there we go, we've got our VLAN, so I'm going to pick kids. It's for all the switches, so if you've only got the one, that wouldn't really matter, but you might have all the access points connected to one switch and you're keeping all the traffic on there, so you can be very specific. And then what we're going to say is we want bidirectional. So what I'm saying here is, although the kids cannot see the other networks can see the kids. So, but I wanted to make sure that everything was being kept in a lane. So I say, right, enable bidirectional. Now you can specify these other things here, like Ethernet type. That was kind of a bit beyond what I was thinking of doing. And also a time range. So you could say between the hours of, I don't know, whenever the kids get up, just before school, but let's say 7 in the morning until 11, 12, whenever they go to bed. My son's older, but he goes to bed a bit later, but whenever they go to bed, this rule is active. Now outside of that, you could open it back up again. So if you've got any things you need to run, you could do it outside of that time. I didn't worry too much about that because what we've done is I put some holes in so I can see certain things on the network, but then they can't see back. But yeah, we'll go through that. And then you just hit create, and that will then do like I've got here, which is the two rules. You'll see there one that says reverse, so it's just doing the same thing. So all the default networks can't see the kids and the kids can't see any of the other networks. Now that will isolate that particular VLAN, and that's it. If you just want your kids to go onto that VLAN, or you're doing it from an IoT perspective, that will then just allow that traffic to go through. Now, I'm going to keep this nice and short because we're going to do another episode in a bit where I talk about this whole items we got up here, the permits, and how you punch new holes into these VLANs. So the first thing to do is just get that up and running. Get the devices you want onto that VLAN and make sure they can see out to the internet. So hopefully that's useful. Please like, subscribe to the video so you can see the other ones that as I upload them. And then we're going to go through some of the more advanced stuff about how to just make it work just perfectly for what you need to do. Thanks everybody for coming along. Sorry this was a short one, but we're going to upload another episode to this very shortly. So thanks very much.